Bonjour, Tanji, and I welcome everybody to Lakehead University's Reconciliation, Learning Truths, and Enacting Responsibilities event. Today, we are meeting to listen to our keynote speaker talk about reconciliation through Metissage. We are really happy that you are here to join us, and I'm thrilled to see so many familiar names and some faces on the screen. And for all of those of you that are joining us from outside of Lakehead, welcome. We're really excited to have you here. My name is Rhonda Coster, and I am the Deputy Provost and Vice Provost Teaching and Learning, and I get the pleasure and honor of being the MC for today's event. Lakehead University respectfully acknowledges its campuses are located on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, and the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy in our Aurelia campus area. In Lakehead's commitment to social justice and social responsibility, we advance the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls for action and University Canada's principles on Indigenous education. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendation to build capacity for intercultural understanding, empathy, and mutual respect has become a guiding principle for the commitment Lakehead University has made in both Northwestern Ontario and Simcoe County, and it will continue to guide our efforts in the future. Before we begin, and as you were waiting in the waiting room, you would have seen our slides. I'd like to share an important notice of video recording of the Reconciliation, Learning Truths, and Enacting Responsibilities event, Reconciliation through Metissage. Participants are just reminded that this is an online event and it's being recorded. And we're doing this to preserve a record of the event in the university's archives and to publicize and promote Lakehead University. By attending, you are agreeing to be included in the recording and its public dissemination in any media now known or later developed anywhere in the world in perpetuity. Any questions participants have can be entered into the Zoom chat, and we will address any of your questions towards the end of the presentation. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, it is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Bryanna Scott is Métis, born and raised in Fort Frances, Ontario, the heart of Treaty 3. Bryanna left her community to attend post-secondary studies at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, where she has achieved, and this is a long list, a bachelor's degree in sociology, an honors bachelor's degree in social work, a master's degree in public health, and most recently, and my deep congratulations again, Bryanna, a PhD in educational studies. She used to be employed at Lakehead University, and still is, as she just informed me, because she is teaching with us still, which is wonderful for our students. Sad for us that she doesn't work here anymore, but she is currently employed as the Director of Education and Training for the Métis Nation of Ontario, which of course they are so lucky to have you, Bryanna. She is taught at Lakehead in the Faculty of Education and in the Department of Indigenous Learning. She's also taught at Trent University in the Child and Youth Studies program, and she has recently taught at the Indigenous Methods course as part of the Indigenous Stream Public Health degree at the Dalalana School of Public Health. In her spare time, which I don't see how she could have any, she sits as the treasurer of the board of Chakotay Aboriginal Head Start and as a member of the Indigenous Education Committee with the Thunder Bay Catholic School District Board. She has a recently minted 14-year-old First Nations daughter from Lake Helen First Nation. Bryanna, I am so excited to turn this over to you and learn from you today. Please begin.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen. Maybe not. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Rhonda. I also wanted to say good morning and welcome to everyone. And I would also like to recognize that we are on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robins-Superior Treaty of 1850. As a guest on this land, I'd like to take the opportunity to recognize the traditional homeland of the historic Northern Lake Superior Métis community, which has been located along the northern shores of Lake Superior since the late 1600s, as well as other nations of Indigenous people that refer to this area as home. So welcome to my presentation. I'm excited for everyone to join us here today. I want to recognize my identity as a child born in Fort Frances, Ontario, in the heart of Treaty 3, created in 1873, a significant treaty area in Canada, where an adhesion in 1875 was made to include Métis people as signatories. This area is known as the historic Rainy Lake, Lake of the Woods, Treaty 3 Métis community. Fort Frances is a place my family is deeply and historically connected to, and where my family legacy remains a part of today. As you first drive into the community, you will find Rainy Lake and the intersection of Colonization Road and Scott Street. And as my home, this is where my story began. And that is part of my legacy. Scott Street, one of the main streets in the community, is named after my family. So like Rhonda mentioned, up until recently, I worked in the Faculty of Education at Lakehead University as the coordinator of Indigenous education programs. And I was very fortunate to hold this position as I worked on my PhD and was really well connected and mentored and gained many role models within the Faculty of Ed and throughout the university. As I had mentioned, I was born and raised in Northwestern Ontario, and I don't plan to leave anytime soon as I raise my daughter and my stepsons here. I just began my new role as the Director of Education and Training for the Métis Nation of Ontario earlier this week. And what an honor and a privilege it is to join such a fantastic organization. I wanted to share with you that I am Métis, a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. I am a first generation learner, meaning I don't have educated parents. And I have a doctorate degree in education today. I beat the odds. The history of a suppressed and dispossessed culture of people that still to this day, many do not know much about. Sorry. There is so much to talk about, so much passion that I have for my culture, for the history of the Métis people. So of course we cannot get to it all today. I have this PowerPoint to share, as there are various resources and links embedded throughout for you to look at later for your convenience. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, who are the Métis? So I do have a couple of definitions that I want to share with you. And I just wanted to mention that I've chosen this resource here that I have on the screen here, Forgotten, the Métis Residential School Experience, as part of the foundation for my presentation today. I do have the resource linked at the back. It's a really short document, about 6 or 7 pages, and it really summarizes sort of the Métis experience with residential schools, which I'll talk about as well. So like I was saying, one of the questions I get asked a lot about are, who are the Métis? So I have a couple of definitions to share with you. Of course, as a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario and as an employee there, I wanted to borrow the definition that they hold on their website. And I do have, like I have referenced some of the links embedded throughout the PowerPoint presentation. So prior to Canada's coming together as a nation, a new Indigenous people emerged out of the relations of First Nations women and European men. And while the initial offspring of these unions were individuals who simply possessed mixed ancestry, subsequent intermarriages between these mixed ancestry children resulted in the genesis of a new Indigenous people with a distinct identity, culture, and consciousness, specifically in West Central North America, and this became known as the Métis Nation. These Métis people were connected through the highly mobile fur trade network, seasonal rounds, extensive kinship connections, and a collective identity, common culture, language, and way of life. Distinct Métis settlements emerged throughout what was then called the Northwest. In Ontario, historic Métis settlements emerged along the rivers and watersheds of the province, surrounding the Great Lakes and throughout to the northwest of the province. These settlements formed regional Métis communities in Ontario that are an indivisible part of the Métis Nation today. And very briefly, in 1993, the Métis Nation of Ontario was established through the will of the Métis people and Métis communities coming together throughout Ontario to create a specific Métis governance structure. And prior to the early 90s, Métis had not been involved or had been involved in pan-Indigenous lobby groups and organizations. There wasn't something specific, big, recognizable through our provincial and federal governments here in Ontario. The Métis, or the MNO, was not created to represent all individuals and communities that claim to be Métis, but those individuals and communities that are part of the Métis Nation. So that is one definition. And as an academic, I also have these other additional definitions, and I'm going to talk about why these are important as well. So when we're looking at who are the Métis, I like to look at the political, the legal, and the cultural Métis. So while the first major Métis communities were established around the Red River in Manitoba, others were later established in Saskatchewan, Alberta, around the Mackenzie River in British Columbia, and around the Great Lakes in Ontario, parts of Quebec up to the Northwest Territories. There are people throughout the world of mixed blood, but in Canada, they are known as the Métis people. So written with a small m, Métis is often referred to as a racial term for anyone of mixed Indigenous, First Nations, and European ancestry. Written with a capital M, Métis is a political term for those originally of mixed ancestry who evolved into a distinct Indigenous people during a certain historical period within a certain region in Canada. And when we're looking at the legal Métis, there is much dispute within the Métis Nation about who is Métis and who is not. A more contemporary definition of Métis references both the French word Métis, which is derived from the Latin word mixus, meaning mixed, and the English expression half-breed, meaning mixed blood of European and First Nations people. Métis provincial organizations across Canada claim that the Métis Nation is a distinct nation among Indigenous peoples in Canada, and as such, their Indigenous and treaty rights are recognized and affirmed under Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. After a very long legal battle that ended in 2016 in Daniels versus Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the Métis are Indians and entitled to rights under Section 91(24) of the Constitution Act 1867. So although the details of this case continue to be worked out, this has brought about a renewed sense of hope for the Métis people. And the cultural Métis. So as Métis people with a unique culture, tradition, language, Michif, way of life, collective consciousness, and nationhood, known as the Métis National Council, we are brought together and are distinguished from our European and First Nation relatives. Culture is often associated with belonging to a specific group. I have been accepted by my Métis community, and I belong to the Métis Nation of Ontario as a citizen. I am a mixed-blooded woman from the historic Rainy Lake, Lake of the Woods Treaty 3 area. I am a direct descendant of both a Cree First Nations woman and European Norwegian man. I am the result of a genesis of a new people called Métis. My family was mobile, living in Métis settlements along the shores of Hudson Bay, moving south to Fort Fort William, and Lac Seul, later settling in Fort Frances. I have strong connections and a shared collective history. I am a testament to my family's genealogy of Métis culture. So why this confusion? Why these definitions? Why does it seem so convoluted? Although there are differences in cultures of Indigenous people, there are some common political and legal issues that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis cultures fight for or advocate for. And these are often in conflict with federal and provincial governments. And these issues include things like self-governance, rights, and land. And these issues are specifically with governments. Through many processes of colonization, the Métis people were often forgotten about and left out of processes. But today it is more important than ever through cases like the Daniels case and Section 35 rights that the Métis can clearly define who they are. And we even see as recently as last night, if you were watching the national news, there was a gathering of provincial Métis organizations where we saw the Métis Nation of Manitoba, or the Métis Federation of Manitoba, want to pull out of the collective Métis National Council. So this is where we get into political, legal, cultural issues around who is Métis, who can be part of the group, and who will be left out. So if you want more information about that, you can look that up, the Métis National Council. In this time of reconciliation, it is very important that we can define who we are, where we come from, where we've been, and sort of where we're going. And another question I get often asked is, did Métis people attend residential schools? So there are a few resources related to Métis people and residential schools. I really like that older document from 2014 created by the Legacy of Hope Foundation called Forgotten, the Métis Residential School Experience. In this document, they tell us that the Métis resistances dating way, way back to 1869 and 1885 led many Métis, including Louis Riel, to fight for recognition of existing rights to land, to governance, including rights to education, to educate our own children, and to live on land that was ours as Métis people. Children from Métis homes were not always admitted to residential school in the same ways that First Nation or Inuit children were. Métis were often considered to be outside of federal government jurisdiction. And when the schools opened, policies were created by the Department of Indian Affairs on how to administer Métis or half-breed children if they would be allowed to be admitted at all. So the department categorized half-breed children into three classes of half-breeds, and would instruct residential school administration to admit only those that were of a certain class. This is an example. It's taken from an excerpt from a letter signed by a team of school officials from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, which was meant to classify Métis. So they divided Métis people into three classes: those who lived in varying degrees of conditions, the ordinary settled life of the country; those who lived in varying degrees, the Indigenous mode of life; and those who form the most unfortunate class in the community, illegitimate offspring of First Nations women and white men. And it was this third class that was entitled to participate in residential schools. Residential schools were funded on a per capita basis and were notorious for their financial mismanagement and underfunding. Treatment of children was often affected by this critical lack of funding and general negligence at the schools. Agents and church officials were able to manipulate school attendance to benefit from the per capita funding systems at the schools. In most large schools, funding for the schools depended upon the attendance. Schools would admit more or less Métis children in order to fill a school or manipulate the numbers at another. It was clear from government correspondence that they rarely did this with much consideration for the needs of Métis children and Métis families. Some government correspondence indicates that Métis or half-breed children would sometimes be moved to or from a school to regulate the numbers at a school. The churches, especially the Catholic Church, had a great deal of influence whether Métis children would be allowed to attend the schools. Since many Métis families attended church, some families would make case-by-case requests to the schools and ask that their children attend. Control of education for Métis children for most of the 20th century fell between the church, federal, and provincial governments. For the most part, provincial schools were meant to educate Métis children. The school boards, provincial schools would also monitor the attendance of Métis children. They were judged by their homes and their appearances, often according to provincial standards. Métis children remember being the outsiders to the residential schools. In some cases, they were told they were too white for the schools, or in other cases, they were told they were too Indigenous for the provincial school system. Métis education was not covered by treaty or federal governments, so attendance often came at a cost to Métis communities, the schools, or the churches. The residential schools did not provide adequate or healthy food for any student. It was important to note Métis were asked to bring their own food, and some were not allowed to use the same dining halls or student residences as other students. Since they were often not admitted officially and their attendance hidden, they often had to be kept separate from other students, almost like a lower class of student in some case. So like I said, there is so much to cover with respect to Métis history, specifically around residential schools, that we possibly could not do it all today. But I hope that this snapshot provided an insight into some of the experiences that Métis children and family had with respect specifically to the residential schools. So how do the Métis fit with the federal government apology, truth, and reconciliation? In 2006, the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement was settled between First Nations and Inuit representatives, churches, and the Government of Canada. The agreement provided compensation for most of the former students at residential schools, compensation for individuals who were physically or sexually abused at the residential schools, a commemorative fund, and additional funds have been also granted. And it created the mandate for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. As well, it negotiated terms of an apology that was presented to residential school survivors and to Canadians in June 2008. Unfortunately, many Métis survivors felt excluded from these processes, since much of the Métis attendance at residential schools often went unrecorded. There were no consistent records kept on their time at the schools. Compensation could only be provided or paid to those who could produce a record of their attendance. In addition, the official list of schools that accompanied the settlement agreement omitted a long list of day schools where Métis children attended. Métis individuals and communities lobbied and continue to lobby to add schools to the official lists and records to acknowledge their time spent at the schools, as well as being eligible for compensation. Often falling into a gray area between federal and provincial jurisdiction, the Métis time at residential schools is remarkably mirrored in the administration of compensation for former students and the reconciliation process in Canada. Métis often have unique stories to tell and distinct experiences, but we often do not hear these. Like many generations before them, though, the Métis have proved resourceful and have found supports in communities. Families have found comfort in their ways, whether they have obtained official support from government or church. Métis families and communities continue to support one another and contribute to groups of survivors and address the legacy of schools on their own terms. So what can we do for reconciliation? So not too long ago, as a PhD student, my specific research looked at Métis student experiences in higher education. And this is where I'll present some of the more contemporary ways in things that we can do today as we look towards reconciliation in education, specifically within the university. So understand the history of the Métis people. Understand the history of the Métis people means everyone needs to learn about the various aspects of Métis identity. And this includes a historical and contemporary understanding of the cultural, political, and legal components of Métis identity. And I understand that that still might be somewhat confusing, but I wanted to put it out there and plant a seed that it is sort of confusing and that this is a contemporary issue among political and legal organizations, Métis people, and this does seem to be an issue of contention today. But we have to continue to move past these things as a group of Métis people or as groups of Métis people as we strive towards reconciliation. And understanding that reconciliation is a process. It's a process individually, collectively, within our communities. And it may look like it's with the federal government or the provincial government, or even other bodies that mirror governing organizations within provinces like Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, specific Métis governments. Understand the ethnogenesis of the Métis as a distinct Indigenous people in Canada helps to share the story of the Métis as a post-contact people, a direct result of colonization. Clearly articulating the strengths of self-identification processes within the university while ensuring university staff are well informed on the history and culture of Métis students. And like I've said before and a few times, it is a distinct culture with its own history, its own way of life, language, and components that make it its own. Indigenous spaces need to be inclusive and welcoming for all Indigenous students. Métis students need to feel comfortable to access the student support services they require to be successful within their academic journey. There needs to be input from Métis students on the types of supports they require. Inviting Métis senators, guest speakers, and having Métis events, including cultural teachings, would help to make Indigenous spaces more inclusive of Métis students. And as universities work to include Indigenous artifacts within university spaces, there should be an equal representation amongst the Indigenous peoples living in Canada. This will help to foster spaces that demonstrate the acceptance of the diversity of Indigenous peoples living within Canada. And I also understand, sometimes seeing a Métis flag or a symbol could be a sign of tokenism, just something to put there. But when I talk to my Métis students, my Métis participants of my Métis research, it was very, very clear to me and very important to them that these artifacts were equally represented within institutions. And that can be tough. That can be a tough one, depending on where those institutions are located. Métis faculty or people in leadership roles would be helpful role models or role model positions that Métis students could aspire to and reach out to for graduate supervision or when needing additional support concerning their educational journey. Providing professional development and training for instructors on Métis perspectives, history, and culture would help make the Indigenous content requirement courses, that experience beneficial to all. And understanding reconciliation is a process that means different things to different people within Canada. For the Métis, there is a long-standing history of exclusion from many government processes, including constitutional rights and the treaty-making processes. And this must be acknowledged. This must acknowledge the harm imposed upon Métis people. Clarifying negative perceptions and stereotypes of Métis people within curricula, specifically in those Indigenous content requirement courses, would aid in combating racism, lateral violence, and discriminatory beliefs and behaviors towards Métis students. Allowing the truth of the Métis story in Canada as told by Métis people, instructors, or through appropriate Métis produced resources, Métis community people, and senators helps to give the Métis people a voice to their contributions to Canada's history. The truth also fosters a Métis worldview of knowledge transmission that can be used by Métis students within their research. So those are sort of my top 10 recommendations, reconciliation items that could be moved forward no matter what university you attended in Canada. And I would like to thank those participants who provided their time and dedication and answered all my questions. So also their patience for me as I talked to them about their experiences, specifically attending universities. And so here, as we sort of round the end of my presentation, I wanted to add some of my favorite resources in so that you could have for yourself to look at when you have the time. So I have them broken down sort of residential schools here specifically as we're experiencing the week of Truth and Reconciliation. And tomorrow, the day that was formerly known as Orange Shirt Day, but a day for reflection nonetheless. And perhaps, you know, if you don't know as much about Métis attendance at residential schools, perhaps you would, you know, click on a link and check out some of these resources. I have some generic resources here on the Métis. There's a couple institutes in Canada for sure that have virtual museums and artifacts posted. A couple of my sort of favorite books that I've gone to. And of course, the Canadian Encyclopedia and the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada have some both historical and more contemporary articles and sections on Métis people. And then of course the Métis Nation of Ontario. So if you're wanting to learn specifically about Métis people in Ontario, there are different governing documents, memorandums of understanding specific to reconciliation with the federal government, how the Métis Nation of Ontario is moving towards self-governance, memorandums with the Ministry of Colleges, Universities and Training, and the Ministry of Education. There's a Métis Ontario Secretariat Act you might want to check out from 2015, recognizing the Métis Nation of Ontario as a governing structure, the only Métis governing structure in Ontario. And then a few, of course, of my favorite law books and some resources on culture. Some of these are newer, just released within the last year or two. And then just a couple of quick links on Métis culture, as I've not necessarily had the time in the past to look at culture. I grew up very much embedded within my culture, but something that was new to me were some Métis tales and sort of myths and legends from other parts of Canada that I more recently have been interested in. And so I have a link here to some Métis tales that I think you might be interested in. Yeah, so that is the end of my presentation, and I want to thank everyone for attending today. And I think we have a session or a period of time for a few questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bryanna. That was really insightful and provided a lot of information that I'm sure I'm not alone in not being aware of. And so I really appreciate the time you've given to us today. I would like to invite people to post any of their questions that they might have in the chat so that I can bring them forward for Bryanna to be able to answer. But one thing that I want to share with you is all of the thank yous that you are receiving in the chat, Bryanna, around the information that you have shared and people's appreciation for bringing this knowledge to us. So just give a second to see if there's any questions that's getting posted. Again, lots of thank yous, which I would echo for sure. Maybe while people are absorbing what you shared with us, I would like to ask a question around your top 10 recommendations that came out of your own research and the time that you spent with various of the Métis students at Lakehead. What is I recognize a top 10 is a pretty comprehensive list, but is there one there that really stands out for you that you think is the most important for us to move forward with or give consideration to?
Yeah, you know, I think this question of identity is really, really important. It came up as a major theme throughout, and it is still, you know, a theme throughout even media and political stuff happening in our country, really getting this understanding of Métis identity. Who is Métis? Who can claim to be Métis? Sort of what does it take? That is very, very key. So it's key for people who are just coming into their culture and coming into knowing that they're Métis. And that can be really confusing if you did not, like, I almost feel privileged in the sense that I've always known that I was Métis from a very, very young age. And I grew up in a very Métis community. But for someone perhaps a little older, or even, you know, in their late teen years, you can have a lot of questions around, well, what does it mean? What does it mean? I'm Métis now. So what does that mean? Mm-hmm. So, you know, if you can't get to that place on your own as a person, it's hard to describe it to others who are also confused. And so I would say that that would be the most important thing, is to really get a handle on this concept of identity and who can claim to be Métis. And of course, you know, there are documents you have to provide to be a citizen. You know, there's like, you know, do I need proof? That's kind of a question that gets asked sometimes too. And yeah, you know, part of it is linking your family to historic Métis communities, but there are resources and things that can help you do that if you are just perhaps exploring your identity or if you think you might be Métis. But overall, it's this concept of identity that really needs to be ironed out.
Okay, great. Thank you. As a follow-up to that, as larger institutions, I think we are always concerned about not undertaking anything that can be viewed as tokenistic, but actually meaningfully engaged. And I really appreciated that you mentioned that element. I'm wondering if you can share some ideas around what kinds of artifacts should institutions like Lakehead be thinking about, and how would we go about determining what would be the right kinds of artifacts for our two different campuses, and in a way that any of our Métis learners and or faculty or staff would feel representative of themselves?
Absolutely. That's a really great question. And the best place to start is with your local Métis community council. So those councils are made up of Métis citizens. Often, you know, perhaps they look a little older. So the experience and the wisdom and the knowledge of that community, whether that's Thunder Bay or Orillia or wherever your university is located, I would start there.
Okay.
That connection to those people, those knowledge holders of senators, so elders, they often have a youth representative as well as a women's rep, etc. So, and those are Métis students, those youth reps, post-secondary reps are Métis students that are so passionate about their history and their culture. You'll often see them within institutions, in Indigenous student spaces, taking up some space, fighting for their voice to be heard and wanting to contribute. So there is so much knowledge locally to go to, for sure. And I don't think that it is tokenism. I mean, Indigenous education in general has come a long way. Before, you know, some universities have not had Indigenous spaces, or Indigenous bodies, governing bodies, councils, etc. And some have been more, you know, have had things like that since the 80s or the 90s, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, within your university, I would also just check with those students, because, you know, they are there. Some of them may be, you know, like myself, who have researched Métis something as a master's student or a PhD student. They're definitely in those mandatory Indigenous content courses. So some sort of survey to see, you know, their experience there, or get their recommendations. I mean, I could probably talk for days about all the things I would do to create inclusive universities of Métis people. But I'm getting a little older myself. And I can't speak for those youth that are there attending on a full-time basis. So I would ask them, engage with them. They're looking for safe spaces, and they are looking to voice their voices. So what better people to do that than them?
Absolutely. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'm just going to turn to that. So if a Métis parent lost his wife and could not raise the children, could he approach the residential school and have to pay out of pocket, like money or vegetables, meat, etc., for his children?
Right. So there are a variety of different Métis specific programs and services that would be offered in different communities in Ontario. So they would need to check with those local offices specifically. And as I had mentioned, previously, the Métis people specifically had been left out of the residential school settlement claim. So there's not a specific process there, but they should connect with their local offices to look at the supports and services that would be available to their family.
That's great. I think you're asking from a contemporary, or answering from a contemporary perspective, which is wonderful. I'm wondering if the question might have been historic as well.
Historically, right, okay. I would have no idea about that, because I don't think that that is captured in any historical documents that I've read specifically. I haven't seen anything like that. And of course, claiming to be Métis in 1800 or 1900 or even 1975 would look really different than what it would look like today. So I would say that they would more than likely be on their own to pay for their expenses.
Right, in relationship to the residential school system
Right,
at that time.
yeah.
Okay, great. Another question comes around, are there Métis in the US?
Yeah, so there are Métis people in the US, because as we know, historically, there were no boundaries. Sort of the boundaries came later. And we know that there are Métis settlements on the other side of the Great Lakes. So I am not a content expert on the Métis of the United States, but yes, they are there. I'm not sure how they have a completely different system when it comes to their First Nations people. So I would check definitely into the history there if they were interested in researching or learning more about the Métis in the United States. And one of the good as we know, and as I've referenced, Métis people were really situated all along the Great Lakes here, specifically in Ontario. So at some point you had to choose which side of that lake you were going to, as colonization and as Canada formed, Canada came about, and as the United States formed. So that's a really great question, and a lot of other history embedded within it.
Great, thank you. We also have a question about, I'm interested in housing issues. Are you able to please share information about the road allowance system?
Right. So the road allowance system were sort of makeshift housing that was created primarily in the Western provinces as Métis people were becoming dispossessed from their land, being taken off of or by the federal government, shooed away from land that they had settled on. So with the road allowance system, it does have its own unique history as well. And it is a term that is often referred to for that sort of makeshift housing, primarily along railways and in places that was not ideal even for a temporary housing structure. And I know the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada has some really good speaking points to the road allowance people. And there are a couple of really great books on road allowance, as well as other academics from Western parts of Canada that have researched road allowance specifically. So I would turn there for information on road allowance.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. Oh, wait, there comes one. What are some good resources that pertain to the Métis communities based around the Great Lakes as opposed to the prairies?
Sure. So this is where I definitely would go to the Métis Nation of Ontario website. You will see different links. There is a section on Métis communities. You will see the Métis Nation of Ontario has done historical research on their own on these communities. You'll also find, so perhaps if you're looking for things about your own family, you will find family information in these reports. There are links there. There are maps in the reports. And descriptions of the types of families, what the areas were sort of known for or what they harvested, and key kind of community people. So I would definitely link you up to the Métis Nation of Ontario's website. There is a lot of information there, and there is one specific on historic Métis communities. And they're quite large documents, so you could look there. And opposed to the prairies, well, I think you would have to probably break down exactly where in the prairies you were looking for. Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba have large populations of Métis people contemporarily and historically. So they would all each have their own resources. So you could start at those provincial websites. So the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, the Manitoba Métis Federation, you could start there. Or you could go into the library and do searches there for Métis communities in Saskatchewan, in Alberta.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, we'll see if another question pops up quick.
And I did see Trudy had joined, so you can always see Trudy if you are a Lakehead University student, and I'm sure she would be happy to help you as well.
Trudy is one of our many wonderful librarians, but a true resource in the Northern Studies Library for sure. Thank you for noting that, Bryanna.